This is our last lecture series of this year. We thank all of you who have attended previous ones and this one for participating, and we're going to be doing this again next year. So please keep your eye out for announcements about our lectures. And if you have suggestions of people that you would like us to consider to invite, please pass those along, and we'll see what we can do about arranging those lectures too. And today's lecture will be by Stuart Buck. Stuart is a native of Springdale who attended university in Georgia, where he studied music, and then Harvard Law School. From there, he clerked with federal judges in Cincinnati and D.C., and then began working in telecommunications law, first in Texas, and now for a D.C. law firm telecommunicating from his hometown in Springdale. And I came across Stuart when I first arrived. He actually sent me an email saying we ought to get together for lunch. And I got a lot of those kinds of emails, just being a new person. People are friendly, which was nice. And I eventually got around to having lunch with Stuart, and it was very interesting to learn that he was working on this book, which is being published by Yale Press. And I also then heard about Stuart through John McWhorter, who is a professor at UC Berkeley in linguistics, who also mentioned Stuart to me, and actually said that he had reviewed manuscripts or book proposals that Stuart had been working on. And so I thought it would be interesting for our group to listen to the work that Stuart is pursuing, and in particular to talk about what is called acting white. So, Stuart.
Thanks, Professor Green, for inviting me to speak today. Thanks for that introduction. The article claimed that the only problem with the acting white theory, according to a research paper released in October, is that for the most part it isn't true. And you might also remember that in 2004, Bill Cosby started giving a series of controversial speeches in which, among other things, he criticized portions of the black community for failing to value education. So in response, Michael Eric Dyson, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and an all-around public intellectual, wrote a book called Is Bill Cosby Right?, to which his answer was an emphatic no. And he claimed that, quote, acting white is the academic equivalent of an urban legend rooted in a single 1986 study of a Washington, D.C. high school. Not only do people claim that acting white is a myth, they also are convinced that it's a dangerous thesis. It's dangerous to even talk about it. In an interview, Michael Eric Dyson claimed that by promoting this myth, Cosby was, quote, beating up on poor black people, the most vulnerable people in this nation. Similarly, the New York Times claimed that there's an insidious danger here, the idea that failing black kids pull down successful black kids can be used as an excuse to conceal or justify discrimination in the public education system. Even more strikingly, the Duke economics professor on whose research this New York Times article is based, William Darity, gave a speech in 2003 in which he described his research as, quote, literally warfare against the acting white thesis. And the word literally was his word, not mine. So what is it that arouses such passionate opposition here? What is the acting white thesis? The acting white thesis is the notion that at least some black kids are dissuaded from pursuing academic achievement because they're afraid of rejection from their peers. They're afraid that, if they pursue academic achievement, and oftentimes this may occur in places where there's tracking and there's more advanced classes that tend to be predominantly white, they're afraid that if they go and join the all-white class, that other students will say, what are you doing in the white class? Do you think you're white? Are you trying to be white? You're acting white, and so forth. So the first question is, does this happen at all? The allegation is out there is that this is a myth. So does it happen? Well, we've all heard the anecdotes. For example, black student Xavier Wright graduated first in his class at a Norfolk, Virginia high school in 2006. According to a news report about his experience, he said, as I've gone through my whole school career, people have called me white because I made good grades and didn't conform to the stereotype. And there are literally hundreds of newspaper stories that report on anecdotes like that. And I know the plural of anecdote is not data, of course, but when there are that many newspaper stories about something, it's hard to dismiss it all as just a myth. I mean, if something gets into the newspaper, there's no reason to assume that people are exaggerating or lying about it at that point. And so normally the assumption would be, well, this might be just the tip of an iceberg if journalists, stumble upon a schoolyard taunt and write about it in the newspaper. But as it happens, we're not limited to anecdotal evidence here. One recent study by Harvard economist Roland Fryer Jr., who happens to be black, by the way, found that smart black students are indeed less popular with their peers. So here's what he did. He used data from the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, which collected information from about 90,000 students nationwide. It's a nationally representative sample from the mid-1990s. And among other things, the students were asked to provide a list of their closest, or their 10 closest male and female friends. So Fryer counted how often each student's name appears on the list that the peers make. So that's an important point, because in some of the other studies you'll find the students are just asked to self-report, are you popular? And as I'll point out later, you can always assume people are going to give an accurate answer to that question. But here, students weren't asked to report on their own supposed popularity. Instead, in this study, you're counted as popular only if somebody else names you as their friend. So it's kind of an objective, or more objective measure of popularity. It's kind of like the way Google tells whether a website is useful, if enough other websites, genuine websites, are linking to it. And then Fryer also controlled for various factors. He looked only at students who attend the same school, so hopefully getting rid of any differences among schools that might exist. And he controlled for factors like parental education and occupation and participation in extracurricular activities, because those affect popularity as well. So the result was that Fryer found that for white students, the popularity went up along with the GPA, just a steady line going up, so that the smartest kids were also the most popular. But for black children, the line goes up, but then it drops down if the grade point goes above 3.5. So the smartest black kids are not the most popular. In Fryer's words, a black student with a 4.0 has on average 1.5 fewer friends of the same ethnicity than a white student with the same GPA. Now the only question I have with Fryer's study is that, as far as I can tell, it seems to assume that the acting white effect only consists of that drop in popularity above the 3.5 GPA. But it seems like there could be an acting white effect if there's a student, for example, with a 2.4 who could get a 3.0 if he tried harder, but was dissuaded from doing so by peer pressure. In any event, Fryer's study is far from the only study to find a social penalty for academic achievement. Let me give a quick rundown of the other studies that found the same thing in varying contexts. Sociologists from the University of Arizona published an ethnography in 1970, and it was called 2468, When You're Going to Integrate. It's a book length, or it's a book. It's named after a high school type cheer. And they found many examples of attitudes similar to acting white all throughout the book, or Uncle Tom often was the term at the time, which I think is a similar connotation. In 1986, the article came out that Michael Eric Dyson referred to. He claimed was the only study on this issue, which it is not. But in 1986, Nigerian-American sociologist John Ogbu and his colleague Signithia Fordham published probably the most famous article on this issue, and describing the acting white criticism that they had found in a Washington, D.C. high school. And Signithia Fordham later wrote an entire book about her experience at that high school. In a case study of 148 black students in an urban school district, Donna Ford found the acting white criticism to be prevalent, and she thought that peer pressure and the fear of isolation are powerful contributors to underachievement among black students. She followed up that study with another one focusing on black female elementary students. Out of 89 participants, 54% reported having been teased for getting good grades, and 31% had been accused of acting white. In a 1993 lecture, two professors reported on a survey of 190 black middle and high school students from Michigan, all of whom were enrolled in its summer academic program, a special summer camp. They found that a sizable proportion, their words, of the students, around 25%, agreed that their friends thought of academic success in terms of acting white. The professors admitted that this was not a random sample, but they pointed out that they were actually probably underestimating the prevalence of acting white because they were just looking at students whose friends were all in these summer academic programs. More broadly, in a 1996 book, the psychology professor Lawrence Steinberg reported on the results of a multi-year and multi-state study that had surveyed some 20,000 high school students as well as hundreds of parents and teachers. And the book itself is not a peer-reviewed study, but there were about 30 or so peer-reviewed studies that came out of this massive project, and the book is kind of a summation of all of those. And what he says is, quote, "We heard variations on the acting white theme many, many times over the course of our interviews with high school students." And he said, "As a result, many black students are forced to choose between doing well in school and having friends." In the 2003 book, John Ogbu returned to the acting white phenomenon, and he found it very prevalent in the middle-class community of Shaker Heights, Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland. He heard from, quote, "several students who had been subjected to the peer pressures to prevent them from answering questions in class or during their schoolwork. And he found that this peer pressure had a negative effect on students' academic striving, particularly for black males." In a recent book chapter, a couple of sociologists had surveyed more than 100 black students in Charlotte, North Carolina, found abundant evidence of acting white. The same sociologists had a broader survey in a peer-reviewed journal where they surveyed 2,700 eighth graders at randomly selected schools in Charlotte. Over 1,000 of them were black. They found both that blacks and that black males in particular expressed oppositional attitudes towards education, such as agreeing with statements like, "My friends think that too much education makes a person give up his or her real identity." And they thought that this finding offers insight into the gender gaps in achievement among black students. Finally, in late 2006, Ronald Ferguson of Harvard released a survey. It was part of a broader research project involving 20 high schools in 8 states. He found that, at least in integrated schools, almost half of the A students reported that they were sometimes or always accused of acting white. So there's a lot of research on this issue. It's not just one paper from 1986 involving a single high school, as Michael Eric Dyson claimed. And in fact, there's several other academic papers that I won't even take the time to mention, but that also find an acting white phenomenon in particular schools. Now, some of these studies are ethnographies or case studies of particular schools, and some of them don't seem to involve random sampling. So, any one study by itself maybe isn't reliable as to what the nationwide trend might be. But some of the studies are surveys on a more national scale. And, when one ethnography after another keeps finding the same phenomenon, whether it's in D.C. or Arizona or Michigan or Ohio or North Carolina or wherever, it seems to fall into a consistent pattern that I think sheds a light on whether or not it's really a myth. So about the other side of this issue, there are a few studies that have come out that purport to find it's a myth. And I'll discuss those. I've mentioned William Darity, the Duke professor whose study was written up in the New York Times, and who had made a speech in which he characterized his own research, before it came out actually, as literally warfare against John Ogbu. And I find it honestly a bit alarming when professors describe their scholarship as literally warfare. I would just contrast Roland Fryer, whose research I discussed at the beginning. When a working draft of his paper came out in 2004, I emailed back and forth with him about it, and he said in an email that his finding was as depressing as hell. He was not happy, to have to be reporting this. And so I tend to trust, not being a social scientist myself, I tend to have more faith in the person who says, this is depressing, but I've got to report it as I find it, as opposed to the person who says, I'm at war, and, by the way, here's a study that backs me up. Anyway, Darity's study was an ethnography. In his research, interviewed a total of 125 students at 11 North Carolina schools. Now, I've cited and relied on a few ethnographies myself, but I would say one problem with ethnographies is that researchers sometimes might avoid asking tough questions about a phenomenon that they're not particularly hoping to find. In a working draft of Darity's paper that was emailed to me in 2004, pointed out that the researchers didn't ask directly about acting white, because they'd originally been commissioned to study just the racial achievement gap in North Carolina and not acting white in particular. But that's something of a red flag to me, that they didn't ask about it, because students are not always to bring up this subject, racial subjects in general, but this subject in particular, on their own. Prudence Carter of the Harvard Sociology Department found in her study of New York students that they hesitated to invoke language about race unless I mentioned it first. And then she says, after a handful of interviews, I decided to ask directly about acting ethnic or acting white. Doing so often resulted in visible signs of relief on the student's part. Similarly, in a story from Austin, Texas, there's a journalist who had interviewed some high-performing students in an Austin school. And she points out that they had been reserved at the onset of the interview, but my question about the acting white business releases them from their shyness, and the room erupts into electrified chatter as they all try to respond at once. Yes, yes, some of them had had that epithet thrown at them, or at least were familiar with the label. So that's why I've suggested that, if you're going to claim that the failure of students to mention this phenomenon is meaningful, it might be useful to ask them about it. So anyway, Dept and his colleagues claimed that there was a, quote, desire to do well academically among all students that they interviewed. Or at least so the students claimed. Again, this is self-reported. Do you desire to succeed academically? Yes. But I don't think you can always trust students to give an honest answer when asked if they themselves desire academic success. Some people will say yes, but they don't follow that up with actions. In fact, Dept and his colleagues seem to provide evidence of this very point. One student was asked why she wasn't in the gifted program, and she's quoted in the article as saying, because I'm lazy and you have to do more projects and stuff. And so Dept and his colleagues pointed out that she also reported, again self-report, to be earning A's and B's in her less challenging classes. And from this they conclude, quote, there was no evidence that she was averse to academic success. I would say, well, that's one way to interpret it, but another way would be to take her to word that she was averse to working at school. And actually at one high school, Dept and his colleagues did find a, quote, burden of acting white with respect to achievement, both from students and interviews with teachers. One black counselor whose daughter had graduated a few years earlier reported that, quote, some of the kids felt that if they were in these honors classes, the black kids looked at them as if they were acting white, not recognizing that you could be smart and black. Another girl recalled being called white girl and Oreo by a few blacks in middle school after being separated from her black peers and placed in an accelerated class with only whites. She described that period as hell. So here at least, even Dept study shows that acting white exists to some extent. And that's all anyone's saying. No one has ever said it exists as to 100% of all students in all times and places, no matter what. I mean, the thesis is it exists for some people, and for those for whom it exists, it has some effect. So it's kind of setting up a straw man to say, well, if we don't find it everywhere and at all times, then therefore we've proved it's a myth. Finally, Dept and his co-authors claim that in order for acting white to exist, it has to be, quote, specifically connected to academic behaviors rather than behaviors such as dress or speech. And you'll find the same distinction made in half a dozen different papers by people who are trying to kind of undermine their own results. And I don't really buy that distinction, because even if acting white is directed at speech, let's say, rather than at grades in and of themselves, it could still inhibit academic performance. Because after all, I mean, if it's a situation where black kids, who want to succeed, end up being sent to classes that are predominantly white, more advanced classes, a lot of kids end up talking like their peers. That's just a fact throughout all of life. That's why when people immigrate to this country, the adults will never learn how to speak English without an accent, but the children won't develop the same accent as their parents. They'll develop the accent of their peers. They draw on the language that they hear from their peers for whatever reason. I don't know why. So black kids who go off to advanced classes where they're hanging around whites all the time, they might end up talking white, so to speak, or with more inflections of white students. So if the one black kid that has gone off to the advanced class ends up being made fun of, a lot of kids may not be able to discriminate between, well, he's just being made fun of for his speech, and if I go to that class and I manage to keep my accent, then I won't be made fun of. It could still inhibit them from performing or from trying to join the advanced classes. The second and third studies that are often taken seriously on this issue are both from 1998. It's a paper in the American Sociological Review by James Ainsworth Darnell and Douglas Downey of Princeton, and a chapter in the book The Black-White Test Score Gap by Jens Ludwig and Philip Cook. And both papers looked at data, nationally representative data, from the National Educational Longitudinal Survey, and both report to find that acting white doesn't exist. But that survey didn't ask about acting white, and the evidence that these papers offer is circumstantial, I think, at best, and it often depends on self-reported information that may or may not be reliable. So, for example, Ludwig and Cook, in their paper, report that blacks drop out from high school at similar rates if you control for socioeconomic background. And then why is this relevant? Because, quote, if the African-American adolescent community does discourage academic achievement, one would expect blacks to skip class and miss school more often than whites. Maybe that's true, but it seems awfully oblique at best, and it doesn't even necessarily strike me as an accurate assumption. A lot of students, black or white, seem to view school as a necessary evil that allows them to socialize with their friends or participate in sports or cheerleading or other activities. Significant Fordham, I mentioned earlier, reported in her book on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. that, quote, for some of the students in the sample group, particularly the males, the extracurricular activities appear to be the reason for coming to school. And she even gives an example of a student who, quote, so much abhors acting white that he refuses unconditionally to complete any assigned classwork. But even so, he maintained a, quote, excellent attendance record. So in other words, so a lot of students might not drop out of school. They might show up. You know, maybe they're not in that bottom 5 or 10% that is so utterly, discouraged about school that they drop out. But there's still a wide variance among the ones who remain about how excited they are, to be there and how excited they are about learning. Just because they haven't dropped out doesn't mean that they're passionate about learning. So another example, Ainsworth, Darnell, and Downey in their paper claim that African Americans students report more positive attitudes toward school than do white students. So here they're relying on self-reported answers to questions like, do you try hard in class? And do other students see you as popular? So then they correlate the answers, and they find out that black students who claim to be good students also claim to be popular. But again, I'm not sure that self-reports are the most reliable way to go about getting the answer here. It could be just that some kids are inclined to exaggerate across the board. They exaggerate when they're asked if they got good grades, and they exaggerate when they claim to be popular. So, you just can't rely on self-reports to get the exact answer where people have an incentive to give a rose-colored picture of their own lives. And that's why Roland Fryer's research, which I mentioned at the outset, is superior, because he doesn't rely on, do you think you're popular? Yes, okay, you're popular. He looks at, do other people name you as a friend? And so it's much more objective. So finally, here's one more study that I'll mention, not necessarily because I take it seriously, but almost the opposite. It shows the links that people will go to say that they've refuted John Ogbu and the Acting White thesis. This is an article from the American Journal of Psychology in 2005. And the co-authors of this study studied 90 black middle schoolers from a northeastern school, and they gave the kids a test that measured, quote, attitudes towards 4 types of high achievers. And so they gave the kids a written description of 4 hypothetical children, about 90 words about each of them, and each one is supposed to be different. So the first type was individualistic. So this hypothetical kid is described in terms like she enjoys schoolwork better when she does it on her own. The second was described as competitive. So for example, he takes pride in being the only student who knows the answer. The third was described as communal, as in like she tries to share her ideas and materials with other students. And the fourth was depicted as having verve, which the authors seem to mean someone who likes a lot of stimulation and a lot of activity and a lot of things going on. So then they asked the 90 kids things like, well, if you're going to the park, which one would you invite? Which one of these hypothetical kids would you invite to go to the park? That sort of thing. So it turns out that the black kids were twice as likely to favor the communal child as the competitive or individualistic child, and the verve one fell somewhere in between. So what on earth does this have to do with the acting white thesis, you might ask? Here's what the authors say. Quote, these findings challenge the explanations offered by Ogbu and Fordham, both of which imply that African Americans frown on high academic achievement in general. In that work, however, the only achievement style presented was the standard model set by the mainstream school system. The present research indicates that when other high achievement options are present, children do not reject them all. Rather, children seem to accept the high-achieving students who exhibit behaviors and attitudes consistent with African American cultural values. So that's, according to them, is why it disproves Ogbu. But I don't buy it, because the only thing we know from this is that if you give 90 kids a description of 4 hypothetical children and then ask them which one they like best, they pick the one that's described as helping other people rather than the one that's described as beating other people. But that doesn't show anything about whether they value academic achievers compared to anyone else, which is the relevant question. here. The study didn't ask the children, even hypothetically, who do you prefer? Hypothetical Linda, who spends all her time in the library, or hypothetical Harold, who plays football and has everyone to his house for parties. I think a lot of us probably remember, just from revealed behavior, around that time, probably children tend to prefer the latter. Okay, so the second major question is it important? It goes on to some extent. Does it have any effect? How do we know? And this is kind of a touchy question, because we all know the achievement gap between the average of black students versus white students. According to the book, The Black-White Test Score Gap, the average black 12th grader is a few years behind compared to the average white 12th grader. Now, by no means, let me make this clear, I don't intend to suggest in any way that acting white is the only cause of the achievement gap between black and white students. And I don't think anyone else has ever suggested that that's the only cause. I'm sure that there are many causes, including historical discrimination, parental education, family wealth, quality of teachers that might end up in inner city schools, and so forth. And this thing just happens to be what I'm interested in right now. And since I mentioned my interest in it, I should probably explain the reason for this interest. So about 3 years ago, my wife and I adopted a newborn baby boy who was black. He still is black, for that matter. And at that time, I read this book on interracial adoption, where the authors interviewed about 20 or so black adults who had been adopted as children. And one thing that most of them had in common, despite their differing backgrounds, they'd grown up in different states, some of them came from relatively poor families, some rich families, and so forth. But one thing most of them had in common was that they'd occasionally run into criticism for talking white, acting white. What's the deal with you? You come from a white family. What, are you trying to be white? What is this? So that's what initially drew me into the whole issue of, what is acting white? What does it mean? What does it mean to have, racial identity in this country? And once you start looking at that, you get drawn into the world of education, because that's where it's mostly talked about, and that's where everyone's attention seems to be focused. So here we are today. Now, as to the effect of acting white in particular, the only estimate that I have come across was, again, from Roland Fryer at Harvard. He estimates that getting rid of acting white would eliminate 11.3% of the achievement gap for those black students who had a 3.5 GPA. Now, again, I'm not sure that this captures the whole effect of acting white, because, again, he seems to be defining it just as nothing more than that drop in popularity above a 3.5 GPA. But again, to the extent that some of the kids with lower GPAs are criticizing each other, or not even criticizing each other, maybe just unconsciously going along with the flow and not ever trying to break out and do something new, the kind of acting white attitude could have an influence that it might be hard to detect. In fact, I think the effect of acting white could be a lot more significant than we are able to measure through surveys and the like. Put it this way, some of the greatest effects of peer disapproval, I think, happen at a totally unconscious level. For example, how many people here have ever worn a t-shirt and shorts to a funeral in the middle of summer? Anybody? Nobody. In fact, nobody's ever even thought of such a thing. Now, why not? If it's a hot day in the middle of summer, it's perfectly rational. You want to wear comfortable clothes. It's more rational than wearing a hot, business suit to a funeral, right? I mean, why would you not wear a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops to a funeral? Because even without thinking about it, you don't even have to bring it to the level of a conscious choice. You know that showing up in that kind of attire would be seen as a sign of disrespect. It would earn you disapproval from other people. You don't even have to think about it. So the most unconscious system of social expectation can also be 100% effective. Nobody even questions it or tries to go beyond it. And if you ask people, do your friends discourage you from wearing t-shirts to funerals? A lot of them would probably say no. It's never even come up. But that doesn't mean that there's no peer pressure effect going on there. So maybe it's the case that the more entrenched the acting white phenomenon is, the less students would even talk or think about it, and the less they'd be able to articulate it to a researcher. I mean, Jay Green has pointed out to me that a lot of 12-year-olds can't articulate fully their inner motivations and everything that's going on. What motivates them to behave in particular ways. They might just unconsciously know that going off to an advanced class would be, seen as anathema to their friends. So they just do what's socially expected. Now, on the other hand, I realize that, of course, that kind of argument might kind of veer dangerously close to the joke where the paranoid person says, "There's an invisible cat in that chair." Someone else says, "Well, how do you know?" "Well, the chair looks empty." Well, the absence of evidence is not, evidence that there's an invisible cat sitting in the chair. But here we have, several independent reasons to think that there is an invisible cat, that there is acting white going on. We have all the studies which I mentioned, and this is just, a kind of thought to suggest, are we really able to measure the full extent of what might be going on here? Now, more generally, beyond just acting white, there are plenty of studies that find that peers have an effect on educational achievement, which I think probably is common sense to a lot of people. On the other hand, I'll note a few caveats about peer effects, which is that it can be surprisingly difficult to measure how much your peers affect, the way you behave. For reasons that were discussed by a guy named Charles Mansky in a very influential article in the early 1990s. He pointed out that many studies on peers that find a peer effect are not really able to distinguish between a true peer effect, where your peers are changing the way you behave, versus an effect that's due to some outside factor or some unobserved exogenous factor. What if something about the curriculum or the teacher or the economic climate or some other unobserved factor improves or declines, and that's what's changing, the group that you're a part of? How do you distinguish, between that? Or what if the fact that peers resemble each other reflects the fact that they tend to come from the same background and similar neighborhoods, and there are pre-existing resemblances among them. Now, there are some studies that make an effort to avoid these sorts of problems. Maybe not fully, but that do make an effort. One way is to use what's called instrumental variables, where the researcher looks at some independent factor, and there's some controversy about when to use instrumental variables and when not to. Honestly, I'm not an econometrician, but I mean it seems like a reasonable approach in some cases. But so here's an example from the literature on peer effects. Take the question: do kids who misbehave in the classroom drag down the academic performance of their classmates? You might think the answer to that is just common sense. But it's actually hard to measure directly because there's so many schools that try to put, or that do put, lower performing kids into a different class, and those lower performing kids are also more likely to be disruptive. So you find more disruption in the classroom where there are more performing kids, but it may not necessarily be because they're causing the lower performance. They might have been lower performing before they even got there. So one researcher was inspired by a Johnny Cash song. He looked at boys named Sue. That's the name of his paper. Not literally, but he looked at boys who've been given names that tend to be female names. And so what he found was that in elementary school, boys with traditionally female names tend to misbehave at the same rate as everyone else. But once they get towards 5th or 6th grade, at a time when children become more aware of sexual issues and start teasing each other a lot more, other children start teasing them for female-sounding names, causing them to lash out and misbehavior. And so boys with female names start misbehaving a third more often in the 6th grade. Now, there's no reason to think that boys with female names are, just by that fact, more likely to be assigned to classes with bad students in them. And there's no reason to worry that bad students like to pick friends who have female-sounding names. So, as I understand it, it might be a useful instrumental variable here, because having a female name is correlated with being disruptive. But so you can look at that factor, and try to measure what's the effect on the peers. So what the researcher did is measure the academic performance of students in classrooms where there were more boys with female names, and he found that just one additional child with a female name, or boy with a female name, results in reduced peer mathematics test scores of 2.2 national percentiles and a 3.2 percentage point increased likelihood that the other student will get in trouble himself or herself. So another way to measure peer effects, probably more accurately, is to take advantage of the few areas of life where students are randomly assigned. So for example, there are some colleges that randomly assign students to dormitories, and there has been a few studies that have found that students tend to do better when they're randomly assigned a roommate who had a higher SAT score. The effect is pretty modest, but then again, that's That's all you'd expect to find, because your peer group often extends far beyond your roommate, right? I mean, some people hate their roommates even when they choose them. So, that's not your full peer group. But even with just your roommate, it has some small effect. The one recent study that I found is particularly compelling as to the use of random effects. In the Air Force Academy, students are randomly assigned to squadrons, or groups of about 120, who live in adjacent dorms, dine together, and compete in sports together, and do all their training together. So basically, they live their whole lives together, and they've been randomly assigned to that group. And in fact, freshman students are not even allowed to enter the premises of another squadron. So this is a great opportunity to see what happens when you randomly assign people to a new peer group and shut off everybody else from their potential source of peers. I mean, it's just great. I mean, if we could do this more often outside of the military, you could find out all sorts of useful things. You could randomly assign people to have a particular diet for 10 years. I mean, I think we could find. Anyway, so the results of this study are, I think, stunningly large compared to other results that you typically find in peer effects literature. They found that, quote, 100-point increase in the peer group SAT score increases individual GPA by 0.45 grade points, almost half a grade point average. And a 1-point increase in peer group GPA increases individual GPA by 0.65 grade points. So, it seems like a rather large effect. When you're randomly put into a group of people that are more high achieving, you tend to, go with the flow, do what your peers do. But Charles Mansky also suggested another way to improve the analysis is to collect richer data beyond merely observed behavior. So he said we should look at, quote, subjective data, the statements people make about why they behave as they do. That's probably heresy to a lot of economists, but I think it might make some sense here because, a lot of the effects of peers, as I said, might not be captured in, just looking at a purely objective measure of behavior. So, I mean, just from common sense, we know that peers influence the students' behavior, attitudes, and academic achievement, especially for people in middle school and high school. I mean, I'm sure we can all remember that awkward time of life when maybe it seemed that the approval of our peers was the most important thing in the world. Perhaps, it has effects on everything, just like the clothes you wear. Perhaps you wore, loafers or polyester plaid pants, or, when I was younger, all the girls had bangs that came out to here. And it's not that they'd all made a rational choice, that this is the objectively best way to behave. It's everybody wants to just be like what their peers are doing. So there are many cases in which people who have experienced the acting white criticism have testified to its power. Ron Suskind, it's a journalist, wrote a book called A Hope in the Unseen, in which he describes this black kid from an inner city D.C. high school who ends up going to the Ivy League. He describes what happened at this school that the kid came from. The principal tried to have regular assemblies to honor the high-achieving students. Quote at the start, "The assemblies were a success, but after a few such gatherings, the jeering started. It was thunderous, nerd, geek, egghead, and the harshest, whitey. No longer simply names on the wall of honor, the whiteys now had faces. The honor students were hazed for months afterwards, and with each assembly, fewer show up." End quote. So I just find it difficult to believe that sort of peer pressure would, have no effect. And actually, Ronald Ferguson's study at Harvard, his survey on a multi-state basis, he reported that almost half of black males who perceive that people like themselves might be targets of acting white accusations indicate that they may hold back from doing their best in school because of what others might say or think. So again, that may not be objectively observed behavior. It's someone telling you what they think, but it's not as much an admission against interest as might be the case. Studies that fail that claim that they failed to find acting white in particular schools, all they're really telling you is they failed to find that someone admitted, that was going on. It could have been going on regardless. So some people won't admit to it if it does happen. I mean, in a way, it's almost like asking kids, are you a bully, or do you make fun of kids who are ugly, or something. I mean, that kind of thing happens in schools, but not everyone will admit to it. But when someone does admit to it, there's not as much reason to be suspicious that they're sugarcoating the truth. So another problem with the peer effect literature, just to set forth all the problems here, is the issue of selection effects. People choose their own friends. They choose their peer groups for the most part. I guess actually, if you go back to the time of junior high and high school, maybe there were times when you wanted to be part of a group of friends and they didn't want you. So, maybe you had to settle for the second best choice. But still, for the most part, people choose their own friends. So maybe there are kids who tend to hate high school already, or middle school, and once they find each other in the classroom or the hallway, they just all end up hanging out together. So it wasn't that their peer group caused them to hate school, it was that hating school caused them to choose those friends. So that the way that's usually presented in the peer effects literature is that this is a problem. That peer effects and selection effects are working in opposite directions, almost. If you find a peer effect, but there's really a selection effect going on, then your finding is somehow undermined. I don't know. I don't know about that, because in a way I think it's far more likely that the greatest peer effect will be found precisely where people have chosen, where children have chosen, like-minded friends. Friends where they have a desire to be part of that group and a desire to maintain approval. And I think that random assignment, while it can be useful, as I mentioned, might very likely underestimate any of the true effect of peers precisely because it lacks the selection effect. So, a couple of kind of silly examples that kind of explain why I think this. Imagine that you're randomly assigned, never mind how, to spend several hours a week for 10 weeks with a group of Hell's Angels, motorcyclists. Now, what's going to happen? Are you suddenly going to grow your hair long and buy a black leather jacket, start riding around, at 90 miles an hour without a helmet? Probably not. Unless you already have an attraction to that group, in which case just imagine that you've been asked to join some other group that you find repelling. So anyway, why would that not affect you? Why wouldn't your new peers change your values and tastes, right? Does that prove there's no peer effect if they don't change you? Well, no, because you didn't choose to be in that peer group in the first place. And you haven't been sitting around, yearning for the day when you finally get the approval of the Hells Angels. In fact, you probably regard their status symbols not with envy, but with a little sort of bemused contempt. So, the lack of a selection effect is what keeps the peer effect from emerging. So imagine by contrast, opposite example. Imagine you've been taking an interest in living more healthily and eating organic food and so forth. So you start hanging out at those natural foods, maybe going to their meetings, and so you happen to strike up a friendship with other people who are like-minded, who have similar interests. And then you start finding out they're vegetarians. Maybe you've never had a high opinion of vegetarianism, you think it's gross, they just eat slimy tofu, you don't want anything to do with that. But your new friends start to have an effect on you. They start talking to you about their reasons for being vegetarian. They start talking to you about the health reasons that they eat that way. They show you pictures of factory farming. Maybe you start to think, oh, this is not so healthy after all. Maybe there's even a moral argument against eating meat. All of a sudden you end up going along with your friends and becoming a vegetarian. That's imaginable, right? You can all imagine that happening. So what happened? The standard explanation would be that the peer effect here is somehow diminished by the fact that you chose to be part of a peer group that was similar in your interests and tastes. But I think it's the opposite. The peer group that you choose is precisely the peer group that has the most power to shape your choices and to prod you in new directions and to make you do things that you might not have done otherwise because you want to keep being part of that group that you value. So in other words, I think it's true to say that selection effects create peer effects. That's where peer effects come from, rather than the opposite. So what can be done? That's a difficult question. I would point to some research from social psychology that has found that having a common task of some sort is useful in getting people to set aside the usual differences that separate various groups. One famous experiment is called the Robbers Cave experiment by Muzaffar Sharif and Carolyn Sharif. This went on at a time early in the 20th century, probably before institutional review boards would have prevented you from doing these kinds of experiments on kids. But what they did was they took around 24 boys who were about 12 years old, took them to a campsite that was known as Robbers Cave, that's the name of the experiment, and they split them into two groups of 12, which lived and played separately. And they introduced a bunch of competitive situations. They had them play sports against each other. So not surprisingly, everybody hates the other sports teams, so they started having a lot of solidarity and friendship with their own group and hostility towards the other group. So then they decide, okay, let's see if we can figure out ways to get rid of the intergroup hostility. So one thing they tried was getting the boys to engage in activities where they were just in the same room, eating together in the same dining room, watching a movie in the same hall, that sort of thing. But this didn't work. Quote, such occasions of contact were used as opportunities to engage in name-calling and in abuse of each other to the point of physical manifestations of hostility. So, what did work? What they found that worked was giving the groups tasks, what they called superordinate goals, that could be completed only by cooperating with each other. So, for example, one day they took all the boys out to a lake and had them swim, have fun. So they got done with that, and the boys are all starving, they're all hungry, and there's this truck that's parked on a hill that's supposed to go get the food. Now, they had arranged with the truck driver to pretend that the truck couldn't start. So he let it turn over and couldn't start. So the boys are all desperately hungry. What are they going to do? So they found a tug-of-war rope and figured out that if they pulled the truck up the hill, they'd be able to get it to start. And it took 20 or so of them to do, more than one group. So they had to cooperate. So they started pulling the truck up the hill, and eventually the driver started the truck, which would have happened, all along. But after those kinds of cooperative tasks, there was, quote, a sharp decrease in the name-calling and derogation of the out-group and the blatant glorification and bragging about the in-group. And substantially more boys started making friends across group lines. So, just as a background thought, the idea of having a superordinate goal in the school system would be a way of getting blacks and white students, to cooperate more, to start minimizing the divisions between, this is our group, that's your group, and nobody should cross the lines. So in another area of research, social psychologists like Elliot Aronson have tended to find that racial tension can go down when certain cooperative methods are used in the classroom. Aronson is famous for inventing the so-called jigsaw method of teaching. And as I understand, what you do is take some written material that's supposed to be taught to the class and divide it into 5 or 6 equal parts, and then divide the class itself into groups of 5 or 6, and give everybody their own paragraphs or their own sections of the material to master. And then you say, all right, you're responsible for teaching the rest of the kids in your group that information. And so it kind of introduces a new dynamic to the group, because no longer is it every kid for himself. If you raise your hand, that's all the credit's going to you. Instead, it's a situation where you have to depend on others to succeed, and your success depends on how well you cooperate with them. So in a couple of experiments, Aronson and his colleagues randomly assigned kids to different classrooms, some of which used this jigsaw technique and some of which did not. They found that the children that used the jigsaw technique for 3 hours a week liked school more than the children who had not used the technique, and the effect was strongest for black children. And they were also less likely to have competitive attitudes towards their classmates. This led Elliot Aronson to suggest that the jigsaw method would be useful in addressing school desegregation problems, which would normally arise when minority students are placed in competitive school situations in which their under-preparation virtually assures they will do worse than their Anglo classmates. Another similar study used the jigsaw technique for a lesson on colonial history. The students were given a test on the material both before and after the lesson, so you could compare. Now, obviously, everybody did better after the lesson. But minority students who used the jigsaw technique scored several points higher on the post-lesson test than did minorities in regular classrooms, even though those minorities who used the jigsaw technique actually did worse on the pre-lesson test. So here's a way that, introducing some kind of superordinate goal that requires cooperation can be used in the classroom. Now, that said, I suspect it's not a cure-all for racial divisions or the achievement gap. For one thing, the jigsaw technique seems to be most suited to relatively small and digestible portions of written material, not a lot of science or math. So maybe a narrow topic in history or social studies, that kind of thing. Another is, it seems like, I'm not a teacher, but it seems like a lot of work for somebody to devise a lesson plan that, may be different from anything that's been used before, and, coordinate how the different groups are interacting, making sure everybody stays on task and doesn't start veering off into just conversations about anything else. And then in some cases, the students might just not be capable of digesting the written material and explaining it and teaching it to the other kids. One of my best friends from college is this black guy who teaches 10th grade English at a high school in Georgia. He's taught there for about 10 years or so, 10 or 11 years. And one frustration he expressed to me, and this was in the context of talking about No Child Left Behind. We're talking about that, and he said it was a good idea, but he sometimes faces 10th graders who don't know how to read. Get to his classroom and just literally don't know how to read. And they've just been passed along all the way through the school system. The school system has just never bothered with them. And so he says, what am I supposed to do with them? The test that I'm supposed to be giving them, I mean, a lot of these kids can't figure out even when they do know how to read. But if you don't know how to read, there's no way you're going to be able to pass an English test. And so same here. I mean, the sort of, having the students read the material and explain to each other obviously presumes a certain, level of preparation to get to that point. Now, beyond just having a common goal, groups are especially likely to set aside their differences when they have a common enemy. I would say they're more likely to. Early in the 20th century, the progressive journalist Randolph Bourne famously wrote that war is the health of the state. Now, what does this mean? In his words, he explained that we all have this tendency to imitate, to conform, to coalesce together, and it's most powerful when the herd believes itself threatened with attack. Animals crowd together for protection, and men become most conscious of their collectivity at threat of war. And I think America probably saw a little bit of this phenomenon after 9/11, if you remember. I mean, for a while, it seemed like the traditional political divisions were kind of slipping away, and people were unified and, going on the hunt after Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. It dissipated after a while, of course, but the notion is having a common enemy unifies people. Randolph Bourne meant that in a very anti-war sense, of course. But on a lesser scale, researchers found that when black and white Confederates tried to interview football fans entering a stadium, the whites were substantially more likely to agree to be interviewed by a black person who's wearing clothing with the same team that they were going to be cheering for. They wouldn't agree to be interviewed if it was a black person from the opposing team. So again, people hate the other sports team. So the famous sociologist James Coleman once proposed that we take advantage of this common enemy phenomenon in school settings as well to create positive peer pressure. And this is from his book, The Adolescent Society, which was published in '61. It has a very useful idea that, as far as I can tell, it's never been really implemented. And it'd be very interesting to see what would happen if it is. He points out that while students commonly cheer on their school's athletic teams, they just as commonly poke fun at other students who study too hard or are too eager in class. Quote, "The boy who goes all out scholastically is scorned and rebuked for working too hard. The athlete who fails to go all out is scorned and rebuked for not giving his all." End quote. So why are the attitudes towards academics and athletics so different? I mean, it can't just be that athletics are more fun than academics, because it's not like you're seeing lesser encouragement of academics. You're seeing discouragement. Why would that be? So his explanation was simple. The students on the athletic teams are not competing against other students from their own school. They're competing against another school. So when they succeed by winning a game, they're not defeating their classmates. They're defeating the other school. And as far as their classmates are concerned, the team that wins a victory is bringing glory to the whole school. It's something to cheer. It's something to participate in and to feel like you're part of the thrill of victory. But by contrast, when students in the same class are competing against each other for grades and for the teacher's attention, then that sort of competition can give rise to resentment and jealousy when it seems like someone else is doing better than you. So in Coleman's words, the scholar's victories are purely personal ones, often at the expense of his classmates who are forced to work harder to keep up with him. Small wonder that his accomplishments gain little reward and are often met by such ridicule as curve raiser or grind, terms of insult having no analogs in athletics. So similarly, the guy who first noted acting white in 1970 pointed out that it's been suggested that athletes are exempt from the Uncle Tom label because athletic achievement brings credit to the whole group while intellectual achievement does not. So what Coleman proposed was that we should have grades be infrequent or even absent, and replace it by contests and games between schools, interscholastic tournaments of some sort, debate teams, music contests, science fairs, math tournaments, speaking contests, and so forth. And then finally, similarly, the sociologist Seymour Spillerman once proposed that we pay cash rewards for grades. And it wouldn't have to be large cash rewards, but on a group basis. That was the important point. Because he says if we give cash rewards to individual students, again, the incentive is to have a group norm where, you don't want to be the one guy that's working too hard and getting all the credit and getting all the money and praise for yourself. Whereas if you're rewarded on a group basis, he said, quote, peer pressure can be expected to encourage individual attainment and foster an interest in mutual assistance. So maybe putting these ideas together, maybe the best solution would be to try giving small cash rewards or some other prize on a group basis, and couple that with a wide variety of scholastic competitions between schools rather than between classmates. Now, I'm not saying that this would be a panacea that would make the acting white or even let alone the achievement gap disappear. But the fundamental truth is that I think people respond to incentives, and they tend to unify when they're facing a common enemy. And so, this might be a way to harness those incentives and that natural inclination to hate the opposing team into producing positive peer pressure. So.
Thanks. Well, you've given us a ton to chew on.
Yes, sorry.
And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. And we can keep running late here, but obviously if anyone has to leave, feel free to leave. And we'll see how far we can go in questions before we call it quits. So feel free to call.
Okay. Yes.
When I came in, I was thinking operant conditioning and towards B.F. Skinner's work. But could a lot of what you pointed out be perpetuated in and by classroom management techniques of teachers? For example, I've watched my daughter for 7 years in the school system, and every year I interact with the teacher, and it's always, well, she doesn't play much with the other kids in a predominant minority environment. And then I say, well, I don't want the onus on her to reach out to them if they don't want to play with her. Because I've had teachers say, well, I've got 3 or 4 kids that refuse to play with anyone. So how are you going to have another kid interact when you have an environment where we've been together for this long versus you're coming in? You see what I'm saying? And then you also have an environment where you see in media the stereotypical blackness and the majority whiteness, and you've got a classroom environment where you have a teacher that is in the majority, kids in the minority, and they're rewarded when they do what's right by the majority person. For example, this black male here, if he does what's right, he gets rewarded. And this black male here that's sitting, and black females that are sitting aside, they see that's the only reward, that's always given. Then how do you reward the one that may not be as high an achiever versus the other? Have you looked at that from that perspective?
That's a good question. There's some research that indicates that actually black teachers might be more effective with black students than white teachers, to a certain extent. And one reason for that might be just what you're saying, that it might be easier for black teachers to sympathize, to know what you're going through, to understand where you're coming from, all that sort of stuff. So that could very well be an explanation for that. And teacher expectations can have a role. I mean, there is a literature on what's called the Pygmalion effect, where teachers' expectations might shape the outcomes, and there's different explanations for why that might be. I mean, I guess the most kind of suspicious the explanation that's the most cynical, I guess, would be that if the teacher's expectations are higher, then maybe the teacher just treats that person in a biased way, and grades the person unfairly or unfairly highly, and so forth. Or if the teacher thinks you're dumb, then the teacher doesn't even look for ways to encourage you to achieve, and and so forth. And that could be going on to some extent as well.
And I thought about that concept too, and I wondered if there are studies that have been done pre and post integration. You see what I'm saying? Because pre-integration, when you had all black schools, you had high achievers. Post-integration, you seem not to have as many high-achieving blacks as you had pre-integration. So
Yeah, well, that's
personally, my theory is maybe we need to go back to integration. You know.
Well, I'll let you make that case rather than me.
You know, only because if you listen, especially since I moved here. I moved here
Right.
3 years ago, and when I hear 80% of black kids in the Delta don't graduate high school, I'm just like, well, maybe we need to go pre-integration in the Delta. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying just separate, but maybe we need to use some pre-integration techniques. What were the techniques that teachers pre-integration used that were successful with black kids?
Mm-hmm.
Cannot white teachers use what black teachers use in the classroom? Not saying separate them, but what techniques were brought forward?
Right.
Lori, there's a study going on in Boston right now on that exact issue, and I can give you the name of the woman who's conducting it.
Okay.
I'd like to know as well, actually.
You like to know too, wouldn't you?
Right. So
It's
you're right there. But yeah, there's actually I'm trying to think of the name of the guy who did the study, but I think his name was McPartland. It was a study that came out right around the time of desegregation. He studied desegregated school, and what he found was that the black students who were allowed to go to like advanced classes ended up doing a few percentage points better than they had in the desegregated environment. And black students who were kept in all black classes within white schools, which happened a lot, actually did a few percentage points worse, which is, I think, not surprising for some of the reasons that you're describing. But yeah, well, I mean, reading up on desegregation or the time before desegregation, I mean, there's just dozens and dozens of people who have talked about how a lot of the black teachers were part of the community. They knew the kids from church. They knew your parents. They maybe taught your parents. And there was just a level of trust and caring there that sometimes doesn't seem to be present from schools today. So that's something to think about as well.
My dear wife told me not to say anything in this discussion. And if any of you know her, tell her I didn't say anything. But if I do say something, it would be what we have discovered over many years, that the independent variable that we're talking about is not all of those studies that you mentioned. The central problem is whiteness. And you've been looking for all kinds of black poor performance in the black case, but we have not examined whiteness. Now there's a growing trend in this country among the cutting edge schools to teach everything there is to know about the idea of whiteness. I teach it here at the University of Arkansas. And I didn't hear you say anything at all about the nature of the idea of whiteness, and we know that the kids are socialized in this kind of environment. What is your take on the importance of inquiring into the structure, future, and so forth of whiteness?
Well, I think that's very important. I mean, I was running against the time limit as it is, so that's a huge topic. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would wonder how you define exactly, I mean, what do you mean by whiteness? I mean, people mean all sorts of things from the pattern of speech to...
They don't know what whiteness is, but they know what every other ethnic concept is. So what I found is a tremendous evasion of this topic, as if somebody has a vested interest in it, and they don't want it to be deconstructed.
Interesting point.
So I'll leave it with you.
From what I can tell, a lot of the research you cited on the academic outcomes, so in particular the idea, as GPAs go up, for the number of friends for whites goes up, the number of friends for blacks goes down. Is there indications of something other than GPAs? The reason I think of the standardized test scores is because for GPAs it seems a little less surprising for me, to the extent that there is the acting white phenomenon, in the sense that since grades are subjective and your white teacher is in front of you, you could be learning mathematics, or you could be learning even more subjective categories. And not be able to, like, it's not mathematical, but not be able to show it to your teacher, but it might show up on a standardized test or what.
Yeah, Roland Fryer discusses that. His take was that it's more useful to look at grades precisely because that's more visible and it's more something that's taking place there in the classroom. Whereas standardized tests are more secretive, confidential. There's not any way to pick out necessarily, oh, that person did well on the standardized test. That's something to...
We definitely ordered them a lot, pretty well, right? I mean, Figlio, who, you cited his Boys Named Sue study. He also has a study saying that basically school grades look nothing like standardized test scores, and standardized test scores are much reliable indicators of academic proficiency. In part because teachers have a lot of reason to give good grades, but here in this instance, I mean, if you have to act a certain way in order to get a good grade from the teacher, whether or not you're learning or not, your ability to do that would be reflected in your grade, but maybe not in your test score.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Question. I know you said that you talked about the social sciences. Did you ever look at W.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, and in that area look at why, how does that relate to academics and blacks and whatnot? Because sometimes I feel like it's kind of like the PlayStation thing, live in your world, play in ours. And so I think students. For black students, it's like, I'm socialized to do this or act this certain way, but when I go back home to my neighborhood, I have to act this certain way. So there's somewhat code switching. And it creates, it's hard on the psyche, especially for black students. And did anywhere in your studies you look at double consciousness or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely a concept that, I'm familiar with. I mean, not as much, I guess it's not discussed as much in all these studies on acting white and that sort of thing, but I could see how that would definitely, or possibly play a role. Wait, sorry, behind you there, she is.
Actually, just behind you. Oh, okay. Please.
I just had a question, like, this all kind of confusing me, because, like, where I'm from Fort City, Arkansas, and that's pretty much kind of like the Delta. And this is, like, totally opposite from where I'm from. It's a lot of, we got a good mix of black and white people, and, like, this is like totally like different from what, because like even though I'm black, we have a whole bunch of people, African Americans in our class, and we took GT, AP, I graduated number 4, and never once was I called, white.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, who even came up with the association that being white was, because you're smart. Who made the association? Because like all white people aren't smart. Some of them not. So I just want to know, like, just because people are smart, doesn't necessarily mean that. Because I was like, I don't know, because where I'm come from, if you don't even put the effort to be smart, you almost talked about because you're gonna be dumb, not because you're being smart.
Right. Well,
so when did association start?
Where did it start? That's a good question. But yeah, it's definitely not, 100% nationwide. I mean, there are definitely places like what you're talking about where, it might seem totally foreign to talk about acting white. But what was the, would you say there are a lot of black teachers at your school, or?
It's quite a few, but it's also a lot of white teachers. It's not as many white teachers as I have now because I don't have. Well, Dr. Moore is my only black teacher. It's a good equal basis because for a city, we have a population like 16,000, and it's quite a good mix of whatever we have. I say it's almost half and half.
Yeah, well,
may I please ask Ms. James to correct my designation. She says I'm the only black teacher that she has. I really don't feel black, and this is in contradistinction to Du Bois's idea that you're supposed to feel a sense of two-ness, and I find that the Anglos have the same sense of two-ness, that it makes them just as crazy to try to act white as I'm supposed to be crazy trying to be black and act white. And so I just want to say that I really, and I'd like to know how do you feel? I don't feel black. How do you feel? Do you feel white?
Well, I guess I don't think about it that much. I mean, that's a good question. Yeah.
What did you say that when she was asking about acting white, when did it start? This whole slogan that it started at integration when these black kids had to go to the white schools. They were a few black kids had to come in, like in Little Rock, for example, and then the other black kids. Did it start then?
Well, there's a lot of people have commented that it started right around the time of, actually around the time of desegregation. Beverly Tatum, who's his or was the dean of Spelman College, she's commented that it seems to be almost purely post-desegregation because the black kids were sent into a white environment and expected to excel in the white world, and before that wouldn't have had any basis of comparison for saying one way was acting white versus acting black. But that's another huge topic.
Does much of it disentangle the sort of overlapping idea that there's this acting white concept and just being the nerdy smart person, which is a stigma for anybody who's like that? I mean, like that one you were talking about, no one likes number 2, the competitive guy that always knows the right answer.
Right.
They ask white kids this?
Yeah, well...
Because I don't think that they would do too well in that poll either.
Yeah. It is tangled up a lot because where acting white, that sort of sentiment is used, it does seem to have the same sort of connotations as, you're a nerd, you're a geek. But also it sometimes seems to mean something like, you're trying to be better than me. And that's an interesting thing that goes to whiteness. How did the idea of better get associated with whiteness in the first place? But you're trying to do something that sets you apart from us, from the group. And some people might say, well, that's just another variant of the nerd criticism, and then others will say, well, no, it's more potent, or it seems like it ought to be more potent, just because of that racial element, the element that you're being somehow traitorous to the rest of us. But yeah, I guess it's hard to fully disentangle those two concepts.
I also think there might be a notion of that needs to be considered with the sort of the rope tug of the truck, and this idea of group behavior. I mean, there are those that excel because they want to play tennis and not football, because they are the individualistic ones. And so I was thinking about that when you mentioned that, that might have sort of a ceiling effect for kids who want to, be recognized as the individual who's, competitively making everyone else
interesting.
adequate.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Stuart, it seems like there might be, with some of your solutions, where basically you want to, these are strategies for forging new group identities, right? What you want to do is create new groups. And two thoughts pop up about that. One is that there are tensions between creating new group identities and rewarding individual behavior to produce results. Because one of the things that occurs to me, if you only provide group rewards, let's say the monetary group rewards, is you might then have collective action failure, where we undermine individual incentives to perform. So we have tensions between these goals. In addition, it's not clear to me that everyone buys into the same goals here. So if what you're trying to do is create new group identity, so new transcendent group, part of why people are behaving as they are might be that they actually are trying to preserve the group identities they have and that they like. And they don't want new group identities. And so that seems to be a challenge too.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I guess that'd be an interesting experiment. I mean, if you could, again, randomly assign people and say, okay, what's going to predominate here? The peer effects, or what new peer effects can we generate? Or create the conditions in which they emerge, versus the kind of free riding, collective action problems that you're talking about. And the balance, what are you going to get? Is it better to have higher average performance, or is it better to have a wider spread with the ones at the top having been really individualistic and really excelling? I mean, I don't know. You have to decide what you value at that point, I guess.
I'm interested in that too, because I'm focused my interest in test taking, ACT, SAT, that type of thing. And there's a piece of legislation that just passed in the state allowing for students at the junior year to take the ACT for free, which seems to be an access issue, and so it levels the playing field. And so if a student steps up and says, I want to do that, they can do that without socioeconomic situations coming into play. And one of the things, over the last 3 years we've been talking to superintendents and principals, one of the things that helped them say yes to it and support it was not allowing the individual test results of that test to impact the overall school's ACT, average, or whatever it was. And I keep trying to argue with the principals and superintendents, if you allow them to start testing earlier, you're actually going to do more for the overall test average, and they seem to change their mind. But it seems like these individuals that want to succeed, it's perceived that their impact on the overall average is actually going to be negative instead of positive. And so
you want just the highest slice to be taking the test?
Right. And so it's really interesting when I keep hearing this idea of group outcomes, or you mentioned debate or things like that. Those seem like group efforts, but there are still a lot of individualized activities that I think the school could possibly get behind. But even at the highest level with the administrators, they don't see that the individual outcomes would ever impact or benefit in a positive way the group outcomes. So, for example, you'd say to the school, hey, if you get behind this as a school, our average ACT will increase and we'll get more funding or whatever else it is. And maybe tying it to funding is a bad thing. That's more like no child left behind. But we could compete with the crosstown school and send more students to college and all those types of things. So I think there's a weird relationship there between the individual outcome and how do you group the individual outcomes into a collective, this is good for the school and this is going to bring us praise or whatever it is.
Right. Well, I guess you'd have to, if you were going to have an inter-school scholastic competition, everybody would have to kind of do it the same way, I guess. If you looked at one entire student body and then just at the best students from the other school, obviously it wouldn't be fair. The way you do it in athletics is, you pick the best 5 guys to put on the basketball court. And then the rest of them just watch, but that's not what you'd want to do in the world of academics. So.
You were motivated with the adoption of your son.
Mm-hmm.
So how is all this information going to help you raise him? And when you adopt again, will you consider Asians, Russians? What will you do?
Well, I can already answer that because we did adopt again just last year. We adopted a little girl from Haiti. So now that's who we adopted when we have 3 naturally. So I'm about at my limit now.
Our children's best friends are all Asians, and I'd like to say, how do I get my children to act Asian? Because those Asians, they play piano,
Well, I referred to Lawrence Steinberg, the psychologist, earlier in his book and his large study of some 20,000 high school students. He thought that the main difference separating Asians from whites and blacks in America is the peer group influences. He said some people will claim that Asians are genetically superior, but if that was true, then why would they have to work twice as hard?
It's their mothers. Their mothers.
I'm going to be a little unfair and ask you questions you don't possibly have enough time to answer, but I think
you apologize.
Right. Maybe it'll deal with the thinking. But anyway, the real interesting question here, I think, once if you establish that acting white as a phenomenon exists, by which I think we mean that the pursuit that black students are pursuing goals that are not in line with best life outcomes. I think what we're talking about is things that produce higher incomes later in life and higher life expectancies and the like. And I think we call that acting white because it tended to correlate with being white, at least for a long time, and so that was a consequence. But so the real big question after you establish that is, well, where in the world is this coming from? right? I mean, basically what we're saying is that there's a whole group of society that's taking on behaviors that lead to lower life outcomes later in life, and they seem to be doing it purposely. I mean, lower life outcomes when we think about these as incomes and the like. And so, I mean, I think that's the big question left. And I mean, there's been some discussion of this in labor economics in particular. I mean, you mentioned the Figlio's name study. There are a few other studies of names in labor economics, in particular on names that are basically only given to minorities, to minority children, and saying that this leads to worse life outcomes later in life. But parents are still doing this, and then their economic models are saying, well, parents are doing it in order to signal to their black community that they're part of the black community, but this is leading to worse life outcomes later in life, and it's a weird circle. And it doesn't have real explanations for why this is happening either. I mean, I don't know, I mean, your book, do you touch on this at all? I mean, because in the end, I mean, if we're going to change, if we think this is something that needs to be changed, then we have to know where it's coming from in the first place.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a very common human thing to want to signal that you're part of a group. I mean, why do you want to join that group in the first place? Maybe that's unanswerable. But I mean, you'll see some groups of people who, get tattoos and piercings all over themselves. And you don't normally, they may be damaging their chances to get hired at certain corporations or law firms. You think, you look like a fruitcake. We're not going to have you in our front office, looking like that. And so they might be damaging their life outcomes, but nonetheless, they're signaling, to the rest of their group, their like-minded group, that hey, I'm one of you, and I'm willing to, do what it takes to be part of the group. I mean, why do people do that?
Well, these are different discount rates too, right? I mean, it depends how much you value some benefit now versus some value later on. So the feeling of solidarity with your group is near immediate, while these later life outcomes are very distant. And so what we may be observing are different discount rates between different groups. I mean, we could ask them.
I mean, there's other potential reasons here too, right? I mean, the fact that performance in school pays off less for minorities later in the marketplace. Minority wages tend to be lower later, so the benefits of working in school are lower, which helps to this reinforcement behavior. But I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that
and women are higher achieving, but
female.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's about it.
Yeah,
looks like about it.
Well,
Let's wrap it up.
Fantastic. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thanks.